see. Perfect. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I hope you all are staying positive and testing negative in these trying times. My name is Kris Trivedi. I am a last-minute replacement, I guess, for some other individuals who are unable to make their presentation today. And I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank the Civil Air Patrol for making this all possible and allowing me to kind of jump in here as soon as I can. But a little about me before I go ahead and get started. I am a recent graduate of American University's School of International Service out in Washington, D.C., where I majored in foreign policy and national security with a focus on U.S. and European relations. And I was a big nerd, so I participated in things like Model UN and whatnot. I also, while I was there, helped co-create the American University Model G20 Summit, which is a program designed to bring college students and young professionals from all over the world to our campus in Washington, D.C., where we actually role play that year's G20 Summit of the 20 largest economies in the world. It's a fantastic organization, and it's being run very well since I left. Currently, the program is also being used by the World Bank to train actual diplomats, which is a very cool thing. But my number one passion in life since growing up and everything has always been aviation. My dad can tell stories of how I would always look up at planes and be able to identify them on what type it is, what airline it is. My room is full of model airplanes to the point where some of them are gathering dust. But yes, definitely a hobby and a passion of mine. So when I got the opportunity at American University to present about the geopolitics of aviation, I immediately jumped on it. And that's what this presentation is. It is an updated version of a presentation that I gave at the School of International Service in Washington, D.C. about the true engines of the global economy and how the geopolitics of aviation actually works. There's a lot of information chalked in this presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in. So aviation has definitely come a long way in a short amount of time, especially since, the first flight since the Orville and Wilbur Wright took to the skies in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, way back in 1903. Since that time, you've had the early onset of flight. You've had people like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. You've had the militarization of flight with the 2 world wars. You've had the aftermath, the advent of commercial aviation, the onset of the jet age and moving things between locations very, very quickly. You had supersonic transport with the Concorde, my personal favorite plane. You've had the advent of space travel from the 60s till now, and so on and so on. And what's very unique about this is that aviation truly has enabled these economies to grow and engage with one another rapidly, because people are now able to go from city to city and country to country quite rapidly, which is why I kind of call it the engines of the global economy, pun fully intended. Furthermore, there's something that I call the democratization of aviation, which has happened recently, meaning that it now is a lot more easier for ordinary people like myself to get on a plane and go somewhere where we need to go, whether it's visiting a family reunion, going somewhere on a business trip, or just going for vacation to sit on a beach somewhere. It's truly a unifying industry. Of course, that was all pre-COVID. We're not traveling anywhere. But the one interesting thing about this current pandemic is that it has really shown the extreme importance that aviation plays in our lives, as well as in foreign policy and geopolitics. Planes have been key to transporting PPE, personal protective equipment, around the world, as well as in the early stages of this pandemic, repatriating citizens who were stuck in other countries back to their home countries. We saw massive airlifts from Europe to the United States, from East Asia to the United States, and vice versa, all around the world, that are still in some cases happening to this day, to repatriate people who've been stuck abroad, to bring them back home. Even more as the vaccine, which we're seeing good news about, becomes more and more available, aviation is going to be key to getting this from its manufacturing sites to anywhere around the world as quickly and as safely as possible. But even as commercial aviation travel demand, going to see family and going on business trips, even as that demand has fallen, aviation's importance is still there. It's still very, very important for the global society and for the global economy. Of course, even before pre-COVID, maps like this one from Flight Radar 24 were chock full of planes going around the world. And what's interesting that you can look at this map and you can see really how aviation has developed. There are large sections of the world where there are tons of planes flying. North America, Europe, East and Southeast Asia, and also you can see tracks, specifically the North Atlantic and over Russia, that show that these planes fly in specific flight paths to get to their final destinations. But what's really important when you look at a map like this is that you realize that behind any commercial international flight is more than a century of political and diplomatic negotiations that dictate who, how, and where these particular airlines can fly. Aviation truly is one of the most unifying industries because it is what truly brings the world together. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. But before I go ahead and dive in, I want to make an important distinction. I'm going to be talking specifically about commercial aviation, which seems kind of odd as I'm talking to the CAP, but it's still an important thing nonetheless. There are two things that I'll talk about that sound very similar. I'll reference things called open skies agreements. For the context of this presentation, I'm referring to negotiations between countries regarding airline service whenever I say things like open skies agreements. There is a military open skies treaty that actually exists. You might have heard about it in the news. It's what allows unarmed surveillance planes like the one in the picture on the right-hand side, this is the American plane, it allows these unarmed surveillance planes to fly over certain countries in order to monitor things that are going on. This is a completely legal activity. It's signed by 34 countries, although recently the United States has pulled out, I believe earlier last month, it pulled out of this treaty. We've yet to see what's going to happen with that. But one thing also that I'm not talking about are things like when you hear in the news of Russian bombers straying over Alaska and being intercepted by American fighter planes. That is an example of illegal military activity. Those are violations of U.S. airspace, and I'm not talking about that. I'll be happy to talk about it at the end of the presentation, but for the main points of this presentation, I'm only talking about commercial aviation. So let's take a look at this roadmap, or rather, I guess, flight path, if you will. It makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to start off with talking about the Chicago Convention of 1944 and the creation of Icao and a foundational history of aviation negotiations and how commercial aviation has developed. I'm then going to move into talking about the 5 freedoms of aviation. There's actually 9. But 5 are very important. I will be talking about all 9 to give you that basis. Those are the foundation of every negotiation between countries. And then in true foreign policy and international relations fashion, like myself being in college, I'm going to look at 3 case studies that apply what we've learned to the real world. We're going to talk about the United States and Cuba, Ethiopia and Eritrea, and Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So the Chicago Convention occurred in 1944. It was an international agreement signed by originally 52 countries and created Icao, the International Civil Aviation Organization, as a specialized agency designed to handle commercial aviation. Of course, 1944, the war was just ending and commercial aviation was about to get a significant uptick. Currently, there are 193 United Nations members that are signed on to the Chicago Convention. Actually, it's all United Nations members except for the country of Liechtenstein, but the Cook Islands, which is a trust territory of New Zealand, has also signed on. So it's 192 plus the Cook Islands, so 193. It is one of the most universally agreed upon UN treaties aside from the UN Charter. This created the freedoms of the air, created airspace rules for navigation and safety standardization, and it's currently the basis for all international aviation negotiations, even to this day. So I've been talking a lot about this Icao. Well, Icao is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It is officially a UN agency. It's part of the United Nations. It's headquartered in Montreal and in this wonderfully beautiful building. I've been there for a conference before, and it functions very similarly to the UN. Each country is represented by an ambassador, and it's run, and the organization as whole is managed by a Secretary General, currently Fang Liu of the People's Republic of China. She's the head of the organization. The Icao Organization, instead of dealing with wars like the United Nations does, deals with matters of aviation. It creates international standards for commercial aviations, including things such as airport codes. You have regular airport codes and you have Icao airport codes. There are always two for every airport in the world. That's an example that you'll see. Things like air navigation, infrastructure, inspection, border crossings, environmental regulations even, and safety recommendations. Icao has been sending reports to Boeing during the ongoing 737 MAX grounding, and they're making sure to sign off on everything as well that is coming out of Boeing. In addition, there are some times when Icao has to step in and investigate air crashes in the event of complicated diplomatic matters where some countries are unable to send their own investigators. So this has happened about three or four times where Icao has taken the lead. Libyan Airlines Flight 114, which was shot down by Israel. Icao stepped in between the two countries and fully took charge of the investigation. Korean Airlines Flight 007 in the 1980s, which was shot down by the Soviet Union. Icao fully investigated that. And the bombing of UTA Airlines Flight 772, which is a French passenger jet that blew up over the Sahara Desert. Icao investigated and found that Libya and the Libyan government under Muammar Gaddafi had been responsible for that. They're also serving as consultants. They served recently on the MH17 investigation, which was shot down by Russia. And they are currently serving as consultants for the recent shoot down of the Ukrainian Airlines plane in Iran. And actually, an interesting thing to note, tomorrow, December 7th, is actually the International Day of Civil Aviation as proclaimed by the United Nations. So a cool thing. And it's proclaimed because it is the anniversary of the original signing of the Chicago Convention in 1944. But I've talked a little bit about the most important thing that Icao does, and that's the freedoms of the air. And the freedoms of the air are extremely important because they are key to understanding how these negotiations actually take place. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the first freedom of the air, which is the right for an airline to overfly another country or countries en route to its final destination. So an example here is an American airline flying from the United States to France while overflying Canada, without landing, I might add, just overflying and the use of airspace. This is one of the most discussed freedoms in aviation. It's actually probably the most discussed, especially in a geopolitical sense. And most countries are granted this freedom to overfly other countries. There are some exceptions. The European Union, for example, has a list of airlines which are banned from their airspace for a variety of reasons. Mostly are related to safety issues where their planes are not upkept really well, or they're not maintained very well. And once those airlines kind of change their maintenance practices, the EU will pull them off of that list and allow them to fly over their airspace. But all in all, most countries are granted this freedom. We'll talk about some restrictions a little bit later. This is important to know because the airspace of a country is sovereign territory. There is no, just like, international waters or land, the space above a country is considered territory of that country. But there is a caveat. There is no solid international agreement on what defines airspace from outer space. Outer space is defined as being non-claimable. It's an international zone. No country can lay claim to it. But again, there's no significant basis on what separates the two. A good rule of thumb is actually what the United States says. The United States classifies anybody who has flown above 50 miles in altitude to be an astronaut. So under the US's logic, anything below 50 miles in altitude is considered sovereign airspace. It's a good rule of thumb. Most countries follow that rule. So let's take a look at some of these maps, right? Airspace is actually also sovereign over land, as we can see here. This is a map of a standard Great Circle flight path between Los Angeles and Paris, France. You can see the normal flight path takes off over the American West, flies up through central Canada, across Quebec, Greenland, and then on into Europe through Ireland and the United Kingdom and down on into France. Airspace is also sovereign over both land and water. So an example of this would be this map. This is the United States' controlled airspace, airspace that the United States actually considers to be themselves. This is not unilateral, meaning the United States didn't just go and say, too bad to all these other countries, we own this airspace. Actually, Icao, the International Civil Aviation Organization, granted the United States the ability to use all of this airspace and to maintain it because at the time they had the best infrastructure. And this also means that under these first freedom flights that they can use, that airlines can overfly countries' airspace, flights from East Asia, like Japan, to Australia, which are on the far left of this map, do actually have to pass over US airspace, which means that the United States and other countries in cases can charge fees for flying over their airspace or their water space in some cases, airspace over water rather. So the United States over land, last time I checked, charges about $61.75 per 100 nautical miles for commercial flights to use their airspace or to overfly. Over water, it's slightly cheaper. It's $26.51. So any day that you see, if we go back to that Flight Radar 24 map, you can see how many planes are actually crossing US airspace. This is important to realize because on long haul flights, these charges do actually add up. It's not just the United States, it's other countries. So let's really quick look back at this map between Los Angeles and Paris. You can see that the airline will have to overfly United States airspace, Canadian airspace, Greenland, which is part of Denmark, so Danish airspace, Irish airspace, the United Kingdom, and on into France. That's a lot of money. And Canada, for example, is notorious in the airline community for charging very, very high fees. They use a convoluted sense of the aircraft's size and weight and passengers and distance flown. It's hard to get into. But all you need to know is that Canada charges a lot of money for their airspace. So let's look at two flights on the same day. So this is Air Tahiti Flight 8 from Los Angeles to Paris on June 5th of 2017. You can see they took a relatively normal flight path, entering Canadian airspace around Detroit, Michigan, flying up through the east coast of Canada, over the North Atlantic, and then on into Europe, over Ireland, parts of the UK, and on into France. Now, in some cases, airlines will avoid Canadian airspace entirely, especially if they're traveling from the US to Europe, because it can be so expensive. So let's look at another flight on the same day, just a few hours later. This is Air France Flight 65, a Airbus A380, which was flying on the same route, Los Angeles to Paris, on the same day, June 5th, 2017. And you can see here that this particular flight actually avoided Canadian airspace entirely to pay less in fees. They actually entered the North Atlantic around New Jersey and New York. It's also important to know that this aircraft, the Airbus A380, is a lot larger than the Airbus A340 in this flight. So the Airbus A380 is obviously going to get charged a lot more because it's heavier. So Air France, the airline, the carrier, decided to avoid Canadian airspace to pay less in fees, or in some cases, no fees. Very smart. But the fifth freedom of aviation is also very important to see because it can be used as a political tool. This is the meat of the geopolitics that we're talking about. There are a lot of examples of this happening, where countries refuse to grant overflights to certain airlines for political reason. We'll talk about a couple. The first one is Taiwan and mainland China. The ongoing dispute between Taiwan and mainland China over which country is the true China. There's a whole host of information that can be talked about in an entirely separate presentation. China, the People's Republic of China, has actually banned the use of Taiwanese-based airlines to fly over their airspace. So when Taiwanese airlines are flying from Taiwan to Europe, they actually have to avoid Chinese airspace entirely and fly a much longer route than European airlines. So China Airlines, contrary to the name, is actually based in Taiwan, and EVA Air are both Taiwanese airlines. You can see they've had to completely avoid Chinese airspace entirely, sometimes adding hours onto what a normally scheduled flight from Europe on a European airline would be, like KLM, which is an airline based in the Netherlands, which you can see is flying directly over China en route to Taiwan. Another example is Qatar. In 2017, Qatar was blockaded and diplomatic relations were cut off by Saudi Arabia and several of its neighbors due to Qatar's ongoing support for Iran. So Saudi Arabia immediately said, we are severing all diplomatic and economic relations with Qatar, and we will prohibit all Qatar Airways planes from flying over our airspace. So you can see here that within a month apart, actually, Saudi Arabian airspace was completely shut to airlines from Qatar Airways flights, which in some cases had to take a long route around. An example is the Qatar Airlines flight from Doha to Khartoum in Sudan. What was normally about a 2.5-hour flight had to become more than 6 hours because it had to travel around the entire Arabian Peninsula. And finally, Russia, the big baddie of airspace restrictions, literally. So here's an example. Russia has actually banned all Ukrainian airlines from flying over their airspace, airlines based in Ukraine, due to the dispute over Crimea and the crisis in the Donbass region. So as a result, airlines from Ukrainian airlines have to completely avoid Russian airspace. You can see here this flight from Beijing to Kiev in Ukraine had to go a lot further south over the Black Sea in Turkey in order to kind of swoop up and into Kiev. This is not this is actually very common. Russia actually has banned all Ukrainian airlines, and as a tit-for-tat measure, Ukraine has banned all Russian airlines from flying over their airspace. But Russia definitely loves to use their airspace as a political tool to get what they want. Of course they do. So here's another example. So in 2018, the United States conducted a series of airstrikes against the Syrian government in response to a chemical attack on Syrian civilians. Syria's government is an ally of Russia. So Russia responded by announcing that they would temporarily close their airspace to US airlines over their airspace. Now, this was a big problem because flights from the United States to Asia flew over Russian airspace because, of course, it's the shortest way to get there because of that Great Circle path. So in April 2018, this actually affected several flights, but 2 flights more entirely. American Airlines Flight 125 from Dallas to Hong Kong and American Flight 187 from Chicago to Beijing were both diverted to Los Angeles in the middle of their flights because Russian airspace was closed, and these planes did not have enough fuel to fly all the way to their destinations while avoiding Russian airspace. So they diverted to LA and had to get more fuel and then arrived at their destinations around 8 to 10 hours behind schedule. So Russia also in that time period had threatened to let the airspace agreement that the United States and Russia have that allows airlines to fly over each other's airspace, they threatened to let that expire completely. So completely close off US airspace, or Russian airspace rather, to American airlines. But at the last minute, quite literally in the last hour, they decided to extend it. Eventually, Russia reopened their airspace, but they wanted to make a statement to say that we can do this. Russia has done this to European airlines as well. In 2008, they did it to Lufthansa Cargo, preventing them from flying over their airspace because they say that they didn't charge a lot of money. So moving on to the second freedom of the air, which is the right for an airline to fly from one country to another country with a technical or fuel stop in a third foreign country. So for example, an American airline flying from the United States to France, but stopping in Canada for fuel. Now, this freedom is a little bit more rare. There are not that many technical stops, but it was important because in the early days of aviation and commercial aviation and transatlantic flights, especially when the Chicago Convention was being written, Gander and Shannon were two key important airports, because planes had limited range. Transatlantic flights could not make it across the ocean like they can do today, so they were forced to stop in either Gander, Canada, or Shannon, Ireland, or some cases both, for fuel. Now, of course, as range of planes has increased, these airports are no longer needed, and tech stops are few and far between. But also during the Cold War, when much of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries' airspace was restricted, back to Russia, the airlines traveling from Europe and parts of North America to Asia had to take a longer way around and actually had to stop in Anchorage, Alaska for fuel, like you see on the left. This was very common. In fact, most, if not all, Asian flights from Europe to Asia had to stop in Anchorage for fuel because they couldn't make it without overflying Russia. Of course, in the fall of the wall, the end of the Cold War, Russia realized that they can open up their airspace and they can charge airlines a lot of money, which they do, to overfly their airspace, and they can use it as a political tool when they need to. So flight stopping in Anchorage is no longer required at all. So moving right along, the third and fourth freedoms of the air are basically the same. They're always granted to one another. Very rarely are they not granted. It's the right to fly from one country to another country and back. For example, the third freedom would be the right to fly from the U.S. To France, and the fourth freedom would be the right to fly from France back to the U.S. These are almost always granted together. Like I said, there's very rarely where they're not granted. Moving right along, the fifth freedom looks like the second, but it's a little different. It's the right to fly from one country to another country via a third country, but allowing the airline to carry passengers on that second leg. So an example would be an airline flying from the United States to France via Canada, but on the second leg of that flight, the airline is also allowed to take passengers from Canada to France. Or, for example, flying from France to the United States with the stop in Canada, passengers can board in France, get off the plane in Canada, but not have to continue all the way to their final destination of the plane in the United States. This is a little complicated, but it's not, once you get the hang of it, it's not really that bad. It's often the subject of price wars, especially with some fancier airlines. For example, Singapore Airlines flies between Singapore and Houston, Texas, with a stop in Manchester, but passengers are also allowed to fly only between Manchester and Houston without having to get on the plane in Singapore. Emirates also does this. They fly from Newark, New Jersey to Dubai with a stop in Athens, and passengers are allowed to get on the plane in Newark and get off the plane in Athens without continuing to that plane's final destination in Dubai. Under second freedom flights, this is not allowed, obviously. So I mentioned Emirates. Emirates loves this. They thrive off of this. Anywhere in red that you see is a route that Emirates is allowed to take passengers on without having to continue to that flight's final destination in Dubai. You can see here Newark to Milan, or New York City to Milan, and then onward to Dubai is an example. And Emirates, being a nicer airline, and oftentimes their tickets are cheaper, they tend to price out other airlines. So this freedom often becomes choked in political posturing and price wars between airlines. So some airlines don't really like this. They're not a big fan. But pro tip, if you want to fly to Milan once coronavirus is over, of course, from New York, fly Emirates, because it's going to be slightly cheaper than flying an airline like United, and you get a nicer plane with Emirates. The sixth freedom of the air is one of the most common as well. It's the right to fly from one country to another with a connection. It's basically saying that airlines are allowed to have hubs. So basically, if a person is flying from country C to country B, they can fly to country A, have a connection there, and get on another plane to country B. This is the hub and spoke model that a lot of airlines do. It's very common. There are entire airlines that only operate on this model. I've picked a couple. The first one is Icelandair, the big sixth freedom airline. They fly and take passengers from North America to Europe with their through their hub in Reykjavik, Iceland. This is a very common thing that they do. Another airline that does this, the aforementioned Emirates, takes passengers around the world from Africa, North America, Europe, and Asia to one another through their mega hub in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Now, there are some passengers that do end their journey in either Iceland or Dubai, but a vast majority of these airlines passengers are actually connecting onward to another destination on that particular airline. The 7th, 8th, and 9th freedoms that we're going to go ahead and talk about are they're very rarely applied in other places outside of one particular area, the European Union. So I'm going to talk about them together, and then we'll talk about why the European Union is very common for this. So the 7th freedom is the right to fly between two countries that is not the home country of the airline. So an example, an American airline flying between London and Paris only. The 8th freedom is similar. It's the right to fly from the airline's home country to two other points in another country. So an example would be an American airline flying to Munich, Germany, and then on to Berlin, Germany. This was very common in the Cold War, actually, when Germany was split. American airlines like Pan Am actually were operating flights within Germany, so they actually were able to take passengers from New York to a hub in West Germany like Frankfurt or Cologne, and then onward to West Berlin. The 9th freedom of the air is the right to fly domestically within 2 points in a country that isn't the home freedom, or the home country of the airline. So an example would be an American airline flying between Paris, France, and Marseille, France, without having to go back to its home country or a third country. So like I said, these three are more common in the European Union. They're not considered Icao freedoms, but Icao kind of acknowledges them, which is why there are 5 freedoms, but there's actually 9. So why the European Union? Well, the European Union, like the common market, has a common airspace market, meaning that any airline based in the European Union has the right to fly between any other country in the European Union. They also have the right, there's a special agreement called the US-EU Open Skies Agreement, which allows airlines to fly between Europe and the United States. This has become very important within Europe specifically, though, in recent times because we've seen large-scale, low-cost airlines like Ryanair, which is based in Ireland. Ryanair is, I believe, Europe's largest airline in terms of passengers carried. I could be mistaken, but it is a very large airline that can take people all around Europe and in some cases to places that are outside of Europe. And the second airline is EasyJet, which is based in the United Kingdom. And of course, the United Kingdom is no longer in the European Union, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Airlines like Wizz Air have popped up recently, which is based in Hungary, another similar low-cost airline that flies between European markets. And an airline called Norwegian Air Shuttle, which is based, of course, in Norway. So Norwegian is an interesting case because Norwegian actually is based in a country, obviously Norway, that's not in the European Union, which means it's not part of the common aviation market between the rest of the European Union states, and also not between the special open skies agreement between Europe and the United States. So Norway actually kind of created an interesting little workaround. So they actually created 2 airlines. They created Norwegian Shuttle, which is a airline that is based in Norway, which has a special agreement with Europe to operate under those 7th, 8th, and 9th freedoms like I just talked about. And they created an airline called Norwegian Long Haul, which is designed to fly between Europe and the United States to try to take advantage of that. But because Norway, not in the European Union or part of the Open Skies Agreement, Norwegian established long haul to be based in Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. All of these countries, with the obvious exception of the United Kingdom, are in the European Union, which means not only are they able to access the common aviation market in Europe, but they're able to access the agreement between Europe and the United States and fly from places like London or Dublin to Chicago or Tampa. It's a very interesting little workaround that they've done. We will definitely have to see where Norwegian is going. I know they're having a lot of financial difficulties right now, so it's possible that within a year, Norwegian Airlines will go bankrupt. But another interesting thing is that oftentimes these airlines are priced significantly lower than other airlines on the same routes. These are low-cost airlines. So if you're going to fly to Europe on Norwegian Airlines or fly within Europe on Ryanair, don't take a lot of bags because you'll have to pay a lot of extra money. Great. So now that we've talked about all of these freedoms of the air and the formation of these negotiations in true IR fashion, I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies. So how do we apply these treaties and these agreements to ongoing negotiations between countries? So the first case study I'm going to go ahead and look at is the United States and Cuba. Of course, we all know in the 1960s and with the rise of communism, the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States imposed a strict embargo on the island nation of Cuba, pretty much banning economic travel and economic flow between the two countries. And importantly, they also banned commercial flights between the two countries. This lasted since the 60s until around 2014, 2015, and 2016 under the Cuban Thaw, when the United States and Cuba agreed to start the process of fully normalizing relations, meaning that they would exchange ambassadors. There would be a United States embassy in Havana, and there is a Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. And also, more importantly, they were going to start increasing the ability of Americans to travel to Cuba freely. They would be able to travel freely between those countries. For example, in August 2016, JetBlue 387 from Fort Lauderdale to Santa Clara became the first regularly scheduled American flight to Cuba since the 1960s. This was a big deal. There was a belief that economic and diplomatic engagement can bring about effective change in Cuba, maybe the fall of the communist regime. You know, we have yet to see that happen. We're not sure whether or not that's going to happen or not. But one thing to notice is that in 2017, President Trump actually retracted a lot of those bilateral agreements, including the aviation market between the two. So a lot of these airlines actually pulled out in 2017 in the wake of these regulatory uncertainties. So we really don't know where this is going from now. Hopefully we'll be able to travel a lot easier between these countries. The second case study that we're going to go ahead and talk about is Ethiopia and Eritrea, two countries in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea fought a bloody war with Ethiopia in the 1980s and 1990s. It was horrifying in their war for independence. It actually contributed to a famine in this part of the world that killed more than 1 million people, one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 20th century. Eritrea eventually got its independence in the early 1990s, but it was completely cut off from other countries. Ethiopia refused to recognize Eritrea. They stopped telephone communications, cross-border travel, and most importantly, a lot of families were separated on both sides of the border. That all changed in 2018 when the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, announced that he was going to seek peace and full normalization with Eritrea, with countries that had formerly been enemies. This was an unbelievable turn in events, and actually it won him and the Prime Minister or the President of Eritrea the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 for seeking peace between these two former enemies. But one thing that they made sure of was that the first sign of peace and normalization was going to be commercial flights between the two capitals. So on July 18th of 2018, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 became the first commercial flight in more than 20 years to fly from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia to Asmara, Eritrea. And on board were former diplomats. The former prime minister was on board, other politicians, members of the press, but most importantly, some of those families that had been separated by years of war were on board. And it's very interesting to realize that the first step of, and the first global realization of normalization was not some people signing a pen on a piece of paper. It was a Ethiopian Airlines 787 touching down at Asmara Airport in Eritrea and having a family reunion for people that had been separated for 20 years by war. It was a very moving sight to see. And the third and final case study that we're going to go ahead and talk about is the most recent. It's between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So most Middle Eastern countries refuse to recognize Israel. There are very few that do. So in this time period, El Al, Israel's state airline, was actually forced to fly a long flight path around some of these countries that refused to grant them overflight rights. For example, El Al flies between Tel Aviv and Mumbai, India. They were forced to fly over the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, because Egypt and Israel have an agreement, over the Red Sea, down around the Arabian Peninsula, and on into India. It added, in some cases, several hours onto these flights, like we saw under First Freedom rules that have been restricted. However, this all changed in 2020, this year, in the fall. The United States actually helped broker what is called the Abraham Accords, which was an agreement between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and later Bahrain was added as well, to fully normalize diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, basically meaning that the countries would officially recognize each other. They would exchange ambassadors. They would allow for people to travel between the countries. There would be economic travel as well. This was a big deal. This was one of the first other countries other than Egypt and Jordan that had agreed to recognize the state of Israel. So on August 31st of 2020, this year, El Al Flight 971 became the first ever commercial flight by an Israeli airline to fly to the United Arab Emirates between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi. And it also was very important because it overflew Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia agreed to grant Israeli airlines flying between the UAE and Israel the right under First Freedom rules to fly over their airspace. It was a big deal. And it's also really interesting to know that El Al flew this flight with their 737s, which actually have missile defense on board. El Al has missile defense for their security, which is actually kind of cool if you think about it. But this particular flight was carrying former politicians, it was carrying current politicians. The Israeli National Security Advisor was on board. Jared Kushner, the advisor to the president, was on board. Members of the press and some airline officials were also on board this particular flight. This also is very interesting. Of course, it being the most recent, has a lot of widespread impacts for the region. The normalization between Israel and the United States and Bahrain was designed specifically to present a unified front against Iran. These three countries obviously don't like Iran, so they agreed that they need to cooperate in order to present that unified front against Iran. However, this also split the region. Countries like Qatar were very much opposed to this normalization. Other countries believe that it was a betrayal to sign these agreements. It still causes a lot of friction in the Middle East. Is it possible we could see in the future, hypothetically, rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia and flights between Riyadh and Tel Aviv? Maybe. I don't know. That would be really interesting to see, especially now that there have been meetings between the Prime Minister of Israel and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. It's possible, but that has yet to be seen, which is why I think this is going to be a very interesting case study to look at for aviation. Now, I know I talked for a lot. There was a lot of information on here, and we have a little bit of time left. So I'm going to turn it over to the moderator and actually see if there are any quick questions that I can answer. I know that I went through this kind of quickly, but hopefully I can answer some of your questions now.
All right. Thank you for the presentation. Very unique, different perspective for a lot of us in civil air patrol who loves aviation. and a lot more we know more about military than this. But there are a lot of good comments. But I will open up with my own first question, Kris, is that in the recent last couple of years, a lot of countries are becoming more of a nationalistic view than the global view. And how do you see this thing impacting not only aviation, but the ICAO's future?
That's a great question. Definitely, it is a challenge. Icao has said that they want to continue this process of increasing commercial ties between countries. But of course, there are leaders who love to politically bluster and say that, we don't need to kind of negotiate or be involved with these organizations or countries. And it is definitely a dangerous threat. I do not know of any countries that have completely shut off their airspace to other because of nationalistic reasons. They've done it temporarily. I know India and Pakistan, when they got into their arguments over Kashmir last year, I believe, they shut off airspace to one another. But I do believe that those airspaces are starting to reopen to commercial flights. That, of course, is not purely nationalist. It's mostly because of war. But we have yet to really see the true impacts of some of these insanely nationalistic leaders, whether or not they actually believe that they're going to cut off flights. There is a movement within Icao to actually kind of ignore pretty much everything they say now, especially in the eyes of the coronavirus pandemic, when Icao actually refused to listen to Taiwan or allow Taiwan to sit in on some of these meetings. So a lot of countries are kind of thinking that Icao is a little bit too political. It, of course, is a political organization, but I definitely think that Icao's future is a little bit in doubt, not that much. We haven't seen a lot of crazy effects yet, but this upcoming decade is going to be very interesting, of course.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't want to dominate. And so one more thing is, and I know that you mentioned about the space is 50 miles and above, but as the space commercialization starts occurring with all the satellite launch and everything else, what do you see the future for the airspace and the economics?
That's also a great question. And actually, that line of 50 miles does not change, regardless of what type of travel it is. So anybody who's above 50 miles is considered an astronaut. They're considered, according to the United States at least, in international international space. Space, I believe, is regulated by the Outer Space Treaty, which was signed in the 1960s. So that kind of dictates the fact that countries are not allowed to engage in militarism or claim particular bodies in space. They're not allowed to go say that the moon is part of the United States now. They're not allowed to say that. So I actually don't think that there's going to be a lot of crossover, even with commercial space travel. I think that's going to be entirely regulated in a different way, probably by some United Nations arm, maybe, I don't know. But Icao actually will not be involved in those organizations, even in commercial space travel, which is actually really interesting. I think Icao should be. I think Icao should create its own little sub-agency to deal with space travel, especially as you could see space travel from one country to another country, for example, or between the Earth and the Moon in the next 50 years, for example.
Okay, we are just about out of time.
Yes.
Point.
And I wanted to thank Kris for his presentation.
Perfect, and thank you very much, and for allowing me to present as well. And I guess tomorrow being International Civil Aviation Day, so happy International Civil Aviation Day as well to everybody.
Thank you.